can let in the people from outside, otherwise they...
Sì, Luca, falli entrare.
Sì, infatti, se no... Okay. Good. Thank you for being here, and it is a great pleasure to introduce Inga Berre from University of Berger, Norway. We know Inga since a long time. I'll do that so that no, okay. Take out the volume. Okay, perfect. Sorry. Some technical details to be sorted out. So yeah, Inga is we know her since quite a few years. She is a professor of the Department of Mathematics and director of the Center for Modeling of Coupled Subsurface Dynamics at the University of Berger, a group that has grown quite considerably. I saw recently a picture of the group. It's quite amazing. And indeed, the group will grow also because Inga has received is a principal investigator of an ERC consolidator grant titled Mathematical and Numerical Modeling of Process Structure Interaction in Fractional Geothermal System. She has always been quite active among the community of applied mathematicians, particularly with the SIAM. She has been a member of the SIAM Council since 2022-2024, and then she has chaired the SIAM activity group for computational geosciences, and she has also been chairing this. I didn't know about that. I went to the web to see what it is. This SET Plan Deep Geothermal Implementation Working Group that, as far as understood, is a European initiative that tries to foster geothermal reservoir exploitation. And she has also been a chair of the joint program on geothermal from the European Energy Research Alliance. And she's a member of the Norwegian Academy of Technology and Sciences. So it is a pleasure to listen to her talk that is about modeling of fracture deformation and propagation in thermo-poroelastic rock and application to enhance geothermal systems. Thank you. You may, the floor is yours.
Many thanks. And if I understand correctly, I might take this off.
Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, it's a delight and pleasure to be here, especially with two UIB alumni in the audience, Alessio, and also sort of academic friends from way back. So last time I was here, it was with a bunch of students, and we had a great time. I should also mention the SIAM conference last year. I know many of you did a wonderful job in making that event happen in the sort of best possible manner, given all circumstances. So yeah, very nice to be back. I should also mention that several of you have, or people like Alessio and Lisa have also contributed to what I will talk about today. We have on related to simulation of flow, particularly in fracture media. So yeah, so I have been interested in couple processes in geothermal systems for many years, and especially this interaction between processes and structures in deformation and how we can model this. I will get back to aspects of this in my talk. Some of you will probably have heard me talk about some of this from previously, but we also have some new results that I want to show. But before I start, I would like to acknowledge sort of the main collaborators, and many have contributed to this work, but I should in particular acknowledge Halvdan Trung and Siren Halvdan, who are PhD students in our group. My long-term collaborator, Eirik Kjeiledal, who many of you know, and Eva Stefansson, who now works as a researcher in our group and funding from various sources. So in this Center for Modeling Couples of Surface Dynamics, we are interested in how injection and production of fluid in the subsurface results in fault reactivation and deformation processes. And this is related to a range of applications. In the talk today, I will focus on processes related to geothermal systems that are illustrated at the right of this figure. And I will start by saying a little bit about enhanced geothermal systems. So enhanced geothermal systems are reservoirs that are engineered to produce from resources that would otherwise not be economical due to lack of natural permeability of fluid. So the idea is to inject fluid at high pressures to reactivate fractures and faults, and also hydraulically stimulate fracture propagation. So this process is effective also in crystalline type igneous rocks, where you have very low natural permeability. And the idea is that in these types of rocks, you typically have anisotropic stress regimes, so you will have fractures and faults that really want to slide. And by increasing fluid pressure, you can overcome the frictional resistance to slip. The fracture slides, and because of surface roughness, when the fracture slides, it will also dilate and open and create improved flow paths. And this has been shown both in the lab and also metal scale experiments in the field. These pictures are from an experiment in France for a fault at, and I think they inserted a probe at 300 meters depth to measure slip and dilation of the fracture. And it shows here that with fault slip, the normal displacement of the fracture increases and you enhance permeability. Now, so this is the type of coupled interactions that I'm interested in, and this process of fault slip is in this case induced deliberately to enhance permeability to get better productivity of the reservoir. But in some cases, this has also led to slip of larger areas on the faults, leading to earthquakes. So one example, which is well known, is the 2006 Basel EGS stimulation, where it was interesting actually because they got the largest earthquake after they shut down the stimulation due to this increasing number and magnitude of events. So this also shows that there are processes going on in the system with pressure diffusion. We looked at some years ago how this sort of elastic normal deformation of fractures also come into play when even when you shut in injection, the fracture will close a little bit, pushing the fluid further into the reservoir, and this may stimulate faults at the rim of previously stimulated regions, causing slip. There was also a well-known case in Pohang where they got 1,000 times stronger earthquake, 5.4, related to stimulation of an enhanced geothermal system. So, of course, this is an effect that you would want to avoid. And interestingly, in this case, the big earthquake happened 2 months after the 2017 stimulation. So it shows that there are lots of things going on. When you inject fluids, you change the mechanical, thermal, chemical, hydraulic state of depth. This sets off a range of processes that affect structures and causes deformation along faults. And in this case, a fault was reactivated that they were not aware of when they did the stimulation. So it was they triggered a larger earthquake. So this shows that this type of what I call process structure interaction in the subsurface is highly relevant in these cases. The processes are highly affected by these fracture structures. So flow is highly dominated by the presence of fractures. And at the same time, the processes changes the structure. They causes fractures to slide, dilate, propagate, and so forth. I think I like to pick up this slide because when we talk about hydraulic stimulation of fractures and faults, it's often this regime where you have a direct hydraulic connection between the injection well and the fault. You increase the fluid pressure in the fault. This reduces the frictional resistance to slip, and you have sliding. This is sort of the classic example. But importantly, you can also reactivate faults if there is not a direct connection, because you may change the loading on the fault by injection. For instance, like I will show later, if you cool this region, you have thermal contraction. This reduces the normal load on the fault and the frictional resistance to slip, and you can have sliding, for example. So this is so there is also what I would call indirect reactivation. So this means that it's important to consider both these sort of what we could think of as explicit faults, but also the deformation in the surrounding region in modeling. Thermal effects, they can also come into play. I just briefly mentioned that if you cool a reservoir, the rock will contract. This reduces loading on faults. And in one example is from Husmuli in Iceland, a geothermal field where they had 2 magnitude 4 earthquakes in October 2011. In this field, they injected wastewater for long periods of time at a rate of 500 kilos per second. So it was a significant cooling over time. And in this paper, they argue that that it's likely that not only poroelastic, but also thermal effects came into play in the triggering of these earthquakes. So there is lots of sort of couple mechanisms going on in these systems that we have been interested in trying to understand better through the use of mathematical models. Just to sum up a little bit, what type of fracture deformation are we interested in? Well, you could have both sort of tensile fractures propagating if you have sufficient extensional stress regimes for hydro or fluid pressure inside the fractures. You sort of hydro frac for fracture propagation. So this is one way of where permeability in the system will be enhanced. There is also this shear stimulation at lower pressures. Even if you don't propagate fractures, you may still reduce resistance to the frictional resistance to slip by increased fluid pressure or change in normal load, and the fracture will slide and dilate. And you can also have a mixture of these processes. And in this talk, I will show some results for all of these situations, and we have also some recent work where we look at the combination of fractures that are sliding and propagating. So conceptually, you could think we have some type of reservoir in the cycle region. We have fractures, and we need to both model the structure, and here we use what is called the discrete fracture matrix model. So we have a porous media with fractures going into sort of this type of complex structure. We cannot resolve all these fine fractures at all scales, so we selected sort of dominating fracture structures, and the rest of the medium the upscale. And this then goes into conceptually what we call a discrete fracture matrix model. There are also other alternatives. You could just say that the medium surrounding the fractures is not really interesting, and do a discrete fracture network model and try to focus on what's going on inside sort of more detailed fracture networks. You could just upscale everything in a single continuum medium. Well, that would not get us far if we're interested in what happens along the fractures. There are also multi-continuum models. And this is always a choice between the accuracy in representation of fractures and accuracy in representation of the background medium. So this discrete fracture matrix model is sort of a compromise in both modeling the background medium and these dominating structures. Now, let me see. So this is the structure, and then we also need to consider THMC processes, so thermal, hydraulical, mechanical, and chemical processes, and the challenges when this interact. So I will, in this talk, make a simplification. So we will not consider the chemistry for the time being. We're also working on that in our group, but that work has not come as far. So it's a very challenging part of this problem. So we focus on THM type effects. We use this discrete fracture model. We will model the fractures as codimension 1, so as surfaces in 3D. And the model is a combination of fracture contact mechanics, a thermo-poroelastic matrix, and fluid flow and thermal transport in both fractures and matrix. And in some of this work, we will also add fracture propagation. So for the fracture contact mechanics, we use a rather simple model of column friction. This just tells us that if there's shear traction, if the shear traction is lower than the cohesion plus the friction coefficient multiplied by the normal load, the fracture will just stick together. And then we can change this. So this would be this black circle here on this Moore diagram. Now we can get to the failure line by either increasing fluid pressure in the fracture, or we could reduce the normal load. So to have slip. So so this is illustrated in this figure. Here we have a force balance between the thermo-poromechanical stresses from the matrix, the fluid pressure, and the contact traction on the fracture. So, and if this situation changes, for instance, by increased fluid pressure, we can have sliding. If the fluid pressure increases even more, then we have full opening of the fracture and there is no contact forces anymore. Yeah. The sliding is related to a dilation due to these rough surfaces contacting. So this is given by this G function with the dilation angle, and that also links to the fracture aperture. And then we also require the fracture surfaces not to penetrate. So this is the contact mechanics model. And then we also need a model for fluid flow in the fractures and in the matrix, and for the mechanics in the matrix. So just to give a very simple description, I said we use what is called a mixed dimensional fracture matrix model. So if we are, this is in a 2D, we have a fracture represented by a line. We have a 2-dimensional matrix, and then we have, for illustration purposes, taking these domains apart. We also have interfaces here, gamma, between the fracture and the matrix domain. If we start by looking at the matrix, we use a BO type model. So we have a matrix momentum balance. We have a matrix mass conservation and matrix energy balance. So these are sort of standard equations, and we consider a low entropy situation where we describe where we can use temperature as a variable. So this is a limitation of the current model, that it's not no phase change or boiling and these type of things. This is something else that we will start to work on. that introduces more complexity. Now, if we look at, so here we have almost a full model, except for the equations for mass conservation and energy balance in the fractures. And they can be found by integrating over the aperture. And that gives us a mixed dimensional model for fluid flow and thermal transport. So these equations show just how the equations look for fluid flow. So here we have the mass conservation and the energy conservation for the fluid, and we have conditions on the, let me see, yeah, on the interfaces. So the equations here corresponds to, so this is fluid flow from matrix, fracture, and the conditions on the interfaces between matrix and fracture. So this equation was also on the previous slide for this matrix region, and then we have the equation for the fracture. Now, I want to just point what has happened here. Well, we need to introduce this term here, the ADT. A is the aperture, accounting for volume changes due to aperture changes. What you can also, what is a little bit disguised here is a very strong nonlinearity. This V is a Darcy flux. The permeability in the fracture, or the flow rate through the fracture, depends cubically on the aperture. So in this term, you have an aperture cubed. So, and this aperture is changing with the deformation of the fracture. So this is a tricky in that sense. And then we have equations describing interface conditions that couples the fracture to the matrix. And some of you know this model really, really well. This is just to illustrate, and this figure to the right shows how the different variables are given in each subdomain. So we have pressure and temperature in the matrix, pressure, temperature in the fractures, and then we have fluid and thermal fluxes, those convective and conductive fluxes on the interfaces. Similarly, we can set up the mechanics model. So we have the thermo-poroelastic stress in the matrix. This gives us equation 1 for the thermo-poroelasticity in the matrix, which is coupled with this contact mechanics model in the fracture. And then we have interface conditions between fractures and matrix representing force, balance, and displacement continuity. Okay, so we discretize these equations using a conforming spatial mesh. So this is like a very, I could say, a simple option. So that gives us the discretization as shown in this figure in the upper right here. And the dots here represent the unknowns. So in the matrix, we have pressure, temperature, and displacement as unknowns. In the fractures, we have pressure, temperature, and contact fractions. And then we have interface fluxes in between the domains. So we use a monolithic scheme, implicit time discretization. We use multi-point finite volume discretization. So that for scalars, that would be the MPFA method, and for vector quantities, this is the MPSA, so MPSA method, for those who are familiar. And the contact mechanics is handled by complementary conditions on the, or is rewritten in terms of a complementary function. And this is again then solved with a semi-smooth Newton scheme. So if we look at the system matrix for this type of system, it will look something like this with the matrix domain, the fracture domain, and the interfaces coupling. And here we have the different unknowns. So just an example, the force balance on the domain 3 on the interface K, gamma K, this would correspond to this part of the system showing the coupling between the different variables. Yeah. Then I will show just some results. So what can we use this for? And I will start with a simple 2D case. The geometry is shown in this picture to the upper left, and the fractures are here numbered. So then we impose, this is in phase 1, it's pure mechanical deformation. We just sort of push this domain, and then some of these fractures will just stick together, some of them will start sliding, and some of them will open. And we do 3 different phases. So the first one is pure mechanics. Then we introduce a pressure difference between the left and the right boundary. So we inject fluid pressure. And in the third phase, we lower the temperature at the left boundary as well. So we can look at these different effects. And this is just a convergence study where we look at the error in displacement in the first phase, then pressure, then temperature, and contact fractions, and this displacement jump. So this corresponds to the aperture. And we see we had some trouble with convergence, especially for fracture 1 and 2, they meet in a kink. So that gives us some local problems in convergence of the contact fraction close to the kink. And this fracture number 6 also has some convergence problems very locally at the tip, which is close to fracture 5. So these are sort of these tricky regions, but else this does not look too bad. So the convergence issues related to the contact fraction, this is related to very local regions. Yeah, this is what the results look like. So in the pure mechanics case, these colors on the different fractures represent their mode. So the sticking fractures are green, the sliding ones are red, and the blue ones are open. So this is the situation after we have just shared the domain. Then when we impose fluid pressure, we see that, for instance, this fracture here, which was previously sliding, this now starts to open because of the increased fluid pressure inside the fracture. And also this fracture number 5, we can see that it was previously just sticking together, but then it is starting to slide a bit, and it's also affected by this fracture number 6. Now, if we lower the temperature, then the rock will contract a bit due to the cooling. That reduces the normal load in the fractures, and we can see that, for instance, this fracture here then is starting to a larger part of this fracture is sliding. And this, again, if you look at this fracture, this is the temperature profile. This color here represents the aperture. A cooling causes this difference in aperture from the previous step. So the cooling has caused sliding of this part of the fracture and a corresponding dilation. Now, yeah, we've also looked a bit on coupling considerations, and we show basically, I don't think I will go into detail on these results, but we show basically that it's important to, many that have worked on this have only considered enhancement of permeability, but not the dilation really of the fracture and how this affects the mechanics. But we show here that this is important because when the fracture dilates, it affects the forces between the mechanical forces between fractures and matrix. Yeah, we also have studied this for a 3D case. So we inject water in fracture number 1. This well corresponds to this blue line. and then produce from number 3. Here we also do 3 phases, a mechanical equilibration, then we do hydraulic stimulation for 10 hours, and then we do a production with re-injection of colder water for 20 years. So I think I will show this slide. So the first row here is the end of the equilibration phase. It shows that the red ones here, this is the fractures that have slipped, and the green ones, they are sticking. So the fracture we inject in does not slide, but it just corresponds to, but it gives a fluid path so that pressure is increased in the center fracture that starts sliding. And the same is the case for the fracture to the right, although there are differences in the slip and aperture change. Now, interestingly, what we can see then, if we start to inject fluid, so this is the second row, then we increase fluid pressure, as shown in this slide, and this changes the situation. So this fracture here we have increased fluid pressure, and that causes this fracture to slip even further. This fracture is not in hydraulic contact, so here we don't have this same pressure increase as shown here. But what we can also see, which is fascinating, is that this fracture in the center, it slides and dilates. That casts a stress shadow on the fracture to the right. So that actually prevents further slip on the fracture to the right. But so this is for the stimulation phase. And then if we look at the end of the production phase, then we have gradually cooled the entire reservoir. So there's this type of long-term cooling process. And here we can see that we now have some slip of this fracture to the right because the cooling has contracted the rock, and that sort of prevents this shadowing effect that goes the opposite direction, the cooling. Was there a question?
Yeah. What's the size of that? Just to understand better the physics and process.
Oh,
How
this
big is the fracture in this?
This is like 100 meter, one fracture. I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's like a kilometer size domain, 1.5, something like that. So this is sort of reservoir scale. Yeah, it's an important question, and the scale of simulations will change a bit. Okay, I'm spending too much time, but I think this is exactly this, an example of this type, what I would call this process structure interaction, that you have these hydraulic and mechanical processes affecting the deformation of the fracture, which again affects flow and so forth. Now we have coupled this also in a very simple model with a simple criteria for fracture propagation. And I will just do this a little bit quickly. You can see here a very coarse grid that we have not worked a lot on solvers, so there is still a strong limitations in how big problems we can solve. So this looks rather crude. Here we have an injection production system. You can see here the scale, 1,000 meters. And here, the original fracture is here in red. We inject cold water, and the combination of increased pressure and cooling causes fracture propagation towards the production one. Yeah, I thought I would also, because I promised that in my abstract, that I would also show another example where this type of fracturing induced by cooling can be relevant. And this is related to the roots of deep geothermal systems. So I will now do a detour in terms and look at some other aspect of geothermal systems. And we have worked a bit with ICER in Iceland. And Iceland is on this mid-Atlantic ridge that is tearing apart 2 to 5 centimeters per year. So it's an extensional stress regime, and you can really see surface manifestations of that in this Thingvellir National Park. And yeah, so this is the mid-Atlantic ridge going through Iceland. I have marked Krafla here to the upper right, which is a geothermal field where they drilled a well in was it 2004, down to 2,100 meters, temperature more than 440 degrees. And this is a natural, very hot hydrothermal system. And the reason you have recharge of this system is that fluids, they circulate at large depths. And it has been shown, though, that in the roots of the system, natural conduction is not sufficient to sustain the heat transfer. So you need some type of convective process, and it's hypothesized that extension of vertical fractures due to natural convection and cooling that changes the thermal stresses and causes further fracture propagation. This sustains these geothermal systems. So this is also a process that we have looked a bit at, and this convective downward migration of fractures was suggested in the early 70s, but it has not been modeled. There were some simple analytical models developed, but we were curious if we could model this type of process. And it was interesting because Lister in his original paper commented that obviously we are here dealing with an extremely complex problem of elastomechanical hydrodynamical interaction that defies any exact mathematical description. So they were sort of aware that this was complex, but that it was a difficult modeling problem, and they couldn't really deal with it at the time. So we have set up a simple model for this, considering vertical fractures in a porous matrix, very low probability. And then we have, this is just modeled the natural convection and how this changes the thermal stresses and causes fractures to propagate vertically downwards. So so this was a simple setup that we did last year. You can see here, I think it's easier in a different slide. So we have pressure here at the left, then we have the temperature profiles, contact fractions, normal contact fractions, and aperture. And I think maybe I will show, and we estimate the propagation speed of the fractures, which is 2 meters per year approximately, which is also in agreement with previous assessment based on very simple analytical models. And we also, I should also acknowledge colleagues at ETH, Thomas Wieser and James Patterson. They also did some modeling of this problem recently in parallel with us, and also that also supports this hypothesis of the downward migration of fractures. Now, this was the slide I was after, because it's very difficult to see the arrows, but these colors represent density. So we have a higher, density in the center of the main, so fluid flows down like this, and then it gets lighter as it gets heated and it flows up. So you have this type of convection cells, and that gradually cools the system close to the fracture, that gives us these thermal stresses that causes tensile downward propagation of fractures, but still a very crude and coarse model. Let's see, 5 minutes. We also worked a bit on this, so that was the detour for the roots of the geothermal systems. So I'm following sort of the progress in model complexity here and not the application. But if we go back to this application of geothermal systems, we've also worked on modeling fracture propagation in these systems. So both the fracture reactivation and sliding and propagation so that you can see a mixture of this fracture shearing and tensile fractures propagating. And this is work we have done with Hao Dang-Trung, and he combines really the previous framework that we have seen with a finite element model for fracture propagation. So we solve the poroelastic problem, and then we use the fluid pressure as a body force in solving for the fracture propagation, basically. And we have, for the pure mechanics, we have compared to experimental results. I will just move on. And we also, in combining with the flow and poroelasticity, we solve for fracture propagation close to the tips of the fracture in order to enhance efficiency. So I think I will just show some of these results. So if we, for instance, consider the situation seen in the upper left, we have one fracture, we inject fluid, the fracture starts to shear. So the fracture we inject in is closed, but it's sliding. And then we get tensile fractures propagating at the tips in a direction normal to the least principal stress, as we could expect. And you can see there is some wiggling of the fractures here. They are reduced with grid refinement, and it's a tricky problem because we have in the beginning of the propagation, we have the mode 2 fractures. So this is more difficult to get accurately than the tensile ones. Yeah. I think I will just skip this. We also looked at the similar cases where we allow fractures to connect, but only this type of T-shaped connection. And yeah, we have some very recent results on this, where we have injection in one fracture. This fracture is oriented so that it will neither propagate or slide, but it gives us a flow path into this center fracture that soon will open, connects with the other fractures in the system. And you can really see like this fracture here has some open parts and some parts that are closed due to the proximity to the other fracture that's opening. So we also here see some of these shadow effects. Okay, so I think now I'm right in time after talking a little bit quickly for the latter slide. So I think main point of this talk is this interactions between these processes and structures, faults, and reactivation, fracture propagation. Also that in this system, what are the governing processes may change in time because we change the structure. And in solving this numerically, these very tightly coupled interactions must be fully acknowledged, else you soon run into trouble. If we want to put this into an applied context, it's tricky. We have done some work modeling a fluid injection in Reichenæs and stimulation of faults there, comparing also with seismic data. But there is very limited availability and there is a certainty of data. So it's but still we could use this model to help understand what was going on. But of course, doing prediction is very tricky in this case. Yeah, and but still, we saw also in that case that this type of models are helpful to see how different faults interact, for example. And this is very useful also for the seismologists who could really sort of understand how the events were localized to different faults, depending on if one fault starts sliding, that affects the state of how it affects the state in nearby faults, and so forth. So yeah, I think with that, I will conclude my talk, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Inga. It's time for question. I think people from, because I don't see if somebody raises a hand, so I think that the only way for people.
Not yet. I will take care of it.
You take care of it. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, Luca. Let's see if somebody in the audience first have some question. Paolo?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Inga, for a beautiful seminar. I mean, it's impressive, the complexity of the problem, as you see. I have, first of all, a curiosity about the sliding of fractures. So you showed example where you have two fractures sliding that intersect at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So are there issues about guaranteeing the coherence of the sliding of one with respect to the other and the whole deformation, or is it naturally taken into account by the coupling? So how do you handle that?
It is naturally taken into account by the coupling, and we don't. We don't do anything particular on the intersection when we couple with the fracture propagation. We deal with the context of the intersection, but we're also here assuming small deformations, so it's sort of naturally handled.
Okay.
But related to intersections, there is a lot. The model for the intersection is sort of naive in a way, so it's not. We don't do anything special. Yeah.
Okay. May I go on with a second question? Also, you have mentioned that solvers probably are now one of the challenges. And of course, you and all the Porous Media Group have done amazing work about the solvers. I don't know. I mean, you just mentioned all the works about the fixed stress approach and also the gradient methods for thermo-poroelasticity.
Yeah.
So, what is your view? Which one do you think more is more promising to go on?
I think for the future, we plan two different directions.
Okay.
So one is to accommodate sort of standard multi-grid solvers to make this type of to make it fit into standard regimes, this black box type of thinking. The other one is to do more tailored solvers, and we plan to work with Jakob Booth, that you know, on this. So I will be careful in terms of saying exactly how we can deal with this. You could think different type of splitting approaches based on geometry. I mean, yeah, I will be careful, but it's not something so far for what I presented. We have not, we have just done direct solvers, very simple, but this will definitely be a big priority. And we will approach it from both the tailored and the sort of black box direction.
Seems, of course, I didn't pretend an answer, but it seems very reasonable to split. This kind of combined structure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Other question from, yes, Paola?
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I think I have a curiosity which is very much linked to the second question of Paolo. So you mentioned at the beginning that you go for a fully monolithic approach, if I understood correctly. So I was wondering whether segregated approaches, or whether you can see that you can set up segregated algorithms, and if they may work, or if they may of any interest from the computational viewpoint.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think the problem here is that the couplings are so tight. The direction we are going in now is sort of inside Newton. We are trying to include more and more, because some of these dependent coefficients, they need to sort of like back in time, but now we are actually sort of going a bit in in a different direction. But yeah, I think it's hard to tell. Yeah, so yeah, I wouldn't be yeah, I would be careful, but you could think that maybe parts of the problem where the couplings are not as tight, you could do yeah, you could do something to enhance efficiency by segregating or splitting or more, yeah. But yeah, it's yeah, I'm not sure how this will work out really. No.
Thank you very much.
Question from the audience at home?
Oh, I don't see any raised.
No. So Anna, and then I have a question as well.
So first of all, thank you. It's really inspiring. So it's a bit of a technical curiosity. You said that the fracture dilates and then it's open. So how do you transition from one to the other? Do you compare the roughness of the fracture? So how do you decide when it's no longer in contact?
That depends on when this is the force balance between the fluid pressure, the contact forces, and the.
So when it's negative.
Yeah. So this goes into again, it's treated the same way as the friction problem. It's rewritten as a complementary condition, and then yeah. So this is how it's dealt with. I'm not sure. So it is not. It has nothing to do with
It's
the
not so magical,
roughness, but
okay.
only of the forces.
All right.
Yeah.
My question was identical, so I'm just told it because the idea that you have a contact friction condition, right? But at a certain point, the fracture opens so much that opens, let's say, at that point you just switch to a condition where you just have zero stresses.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is handled, but there's no.
But the complementary,
yeah.
The complementary condition. Okay, okay. That you write in terms of complementary functions, of course.
Exactly.
To do the semi-smooth, which is something we're trying also. So, is someone from home wishing to ask something? Again, Anna?
So you mentioned that there are several non-linearities in the problem, and all of them are dealt together in a monolithic way. So would you say that the one that gives more problem is the contact condition, or it depends?
Well, at the moment now, the more tricky part is the permeability, actually.
Unexpected.
Yeah, so we are, well, but that relates to the aperture. So we are, so we are now working to include, there is this automatic differentiation framework where we are including coupling more tightly in the permeability changes related to aperture changes. Oh, thanks.
Hey, there you have a cubic, you're assuming Stokes flow instead of fracture, so you have a cubic relation between, okay.
And this becomes, I mean, it becomes very challenging because what we would like to consider for the future is to, here we use the very simple energy equation with a single phase flow. But in these deep systems, what is interesting is that when you have these volume changes, when a pressure dilates or opens, you can expect that you will have local boiling related to the pressure reduction due to the volume changes. And then, so this is sort of one of the questions we're interested in, also whether it would be possible to model this type of mechanism. But then it's then this linking of the volume change, the aperture changes, the permeability changes, and this becomes very involved, let's say. And then you need to couple it with flash calculations as well. Yeah.
If there are no questions from home, I will give the last question. That's curiosity, because you mentioned that so far you are neglecting chemistry, chemical effects. So the question is, however, what is your opinion on the importance of the chemical part in this type of processes?
So we know that the geochemistry is highly important for these deep systems. They have a very high salt content. So both in terms of modeling, if you want to model a multi-phase flow, this affects the boiling point, for instance. So that's one side of it. And you also know that you see a lot of scaling in these systems, because when you reduce the pressure, you have a lot of mineral precipitation, dissolution and precipitation. So I can, and there is also actually a problem for this very high temperatures that the geochemical models don't exist. This is also an issue. But so we can just say it's highly important. We totally neglect it in these simulations. It will affect permeability, we know. But I know you're also working on geochemistry. So when we have also started
not adapt on those conditions. Not at those. We're working a little bit, but not of those conditions.
And we will also probably not get there. Yeah, right now it's simple models. We have to start somewhere.
Okay, if there are no other questions from the audience, I thank again Inga. She will be staying here, right, today. I don't know if we have organized something.
Some food after.
Yeah, now there is some food.
Yeah, so we have some coffee break after the talk of Inga, and then we go lunch together if we don't eat too much coffee break. And then in the afternoon we have a discussion. So I already contact some of the people. If someone else want to join, you are free to come. You also have some time for informal presentation, and then there is. It's 2:30 in the in B51.
Unfortunately, I'm lecturing, so I will leave you. Hello. Okay. Thank you again. And where is the coffee break? Just to know.